of Yancey tells a heartbreaking story about a European immigrant suffering from leukemia. And it's a story about a woman who was asked if she had family, and she replied that her only son was trying to get emergency leave from the Air Force so he could be with her. And her husband? Well, she swallowed a few times, and then she said, "He came to see me just once. I was in the hospital. He brought me my bathrobe and a few things, and the doctor stood in the hallway and told him about her leukemia. And then her voice started to crack, and she dabbed at her eyes before she could say that he went home that night. He packed up all of the things that he had, and he left, and she never saw him again." She was then asked, "How long had you been married?" And she said, 37 years. 37 years of marriage, and he walked out on her when she contracted a fatal disease. Here's what's really disturbing. Yancey notes that some researchers report a 70% breakup rate in marriages in which one of the partners has a terminal illness. Rejection can be one of the most painful experiences any of us can have. Charles Schulz of Peanuts cartoon fame has never forgotten that the yearbook staff rejected his every cartoon. Henry Kissinger is best remembered by his classmates as the kid who nobody wanted to eat lunch with at school. Dr. Seuss, one of the most popular children's authors of all times, got more than 24 rejection slips before Cat in the Hat made it to print. The Diary of Anne Frank, a book that has inspired millions, was rejected 15 times and called a very dull read by a publisher. And Steven Spielberg applied to film schools and he was rejected. But he's done all right for himself as a director of blockbuster films. Elizabeth Barrett, she married the poet Robert Browning, and she married him against her parents' wishes. In fact, they objected so much to her marriage that they disowned her. And as many of you may know, her marriage was a beautiful, happy relationship for both Elizabeth and Robert. In spite of the hurt of being rejected by her family, Elizabeth continued to write regularly to them, and in each letter, she told her parents how much she continued to love them, and she received no response. Then after total silence for 10 years from her parents, a large package arrived. Elizabeth eagerly opened it. The box contained all of the letters that she had written since her marriage to Robert, and not one had been opened. Rejection. Rejection can be one of the most traumatic things that can happen to any of us. And sooner or later, rejection happens to everyone, and it happened to Jesus. We're going to listen to what it says in Mark 6, verses 1 to 6, but first I want to say I am reading from the Living Bible translation, a paraphrased version of the Bible that was rejected by 63 publishers. And finally, it was self-published by Ken Taylor, and quite unexpectedly, the Living Bible became one of the biggest bestsellers of all time. Reading now verses from Mark 6. Jesus left that section of the country and returned with his disciples to Nazareth, his hometown. The next Sabbath, he went to the synagogue to teach, and the people were astonished at his wisdom and his miracles because he was just a local man like themselves. "He's no better than we are," they said. "He's just a carpenter, Mary's boy, a brother of James and Joseph, Judas and Simon, and his sisters live right here among us." And they were offended. Then Jesus told them, "A prophet is honored everywhere except in his hometown and among his relatives and by his own family." And because of their unbelief, he couldn't do many mighty miracles among them, except to place his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he could hardly accept the fact that they wouldn't believe in him. And then he went out among the villages, teaching. Jesus had been teaching effectively, wisely. But the people of his own hometown saw him only as a carpenter. They rejected his authority because he was one of their peers. They didn't see Jesus for who he really was. How did Jesus react? How did he handle rejection? What did he do? No doubt he was hurt by the lack of faith, but he did not let that rejection go to the core of his being and steal the best of who he was and what he was called to do. Because in the last verse, we are told that he went out then among other villages teaching. In other words, he moved on, he carried on, even though there were those who refused to believe in who he was and what he was capable of doing. He did not let that lie settle in his heart. He continued believing in himself and in what God called him to do. Rejection was not going to steal the best of who he was and the things he had to do. His own people rejected him. One who was close to him betrayed him. Another one denied him. And when he needed them the most, almost all of his friends turned their backs on him. He knew what it was like to have those who once showered him with praise to reject and even shall crucify him. And you know, all of this was foretold. It was all foretold in the Old Testament. In Psalm 118, it says this: "The stone rejected by the builders has now become the capstone of the arch. This is the Lord's doing, and it's marvelous to see." In the New Testament, in Matthew 22, Jesus says this to the religious leaders: "Didn't you ever read the scriptures? The stone rejected by the builders has been made the honored cornerstone. How remarkable, what an amazing thing the Lord has done." Jesus is referring to himself as the stone rejected by the builders. And even though he was rejected by many, he would become the cornerstone of his new building, the church. And we need to understand that a cornerstone is everything when building a structure. A cornerstone is laid at the beginning in the foundation. Everything else is built upon this one cornerstone. If the cornerstone is straight and square, then the rest of the building will be straight and square. A building that leans will not endure. Jesus, the stone that was rejected, became the cornerstone, the most important stone in the new temple that God alone was constructing, the Church of Jesus Christ. Something interesting about Michelangelo's magnificent statue of David is that it was carved from a block of marble 18 feet high, but perhaps what you didn't know is that Michelangelo was not the first person to attempt to craft a statue from that chunk of marble. An earlier artist named Agostino di Duccio selected that huge block of stone 40 years earlier and had begun sculpting a statue of either David or an Old Testament prophet. But di Duccio gave up when he discovered how difficult it was. The piece of marble, he said, was thin, misshapen, and he said, "I can do nothing with it," and so he gave up. But it was that same block of marble that Michelangelo used to create the statue of David. He took that stone that had been rejected and with his superior skill carved David that has thrilled the world for years. The stone that was rejected, the stone being Jesus Christ, has influenced the world more than anyone for years. Rejection is not synonymous with failure. Rejection need not be a forecast of one's future? A brilliant British theologian, G.K. Chesterton, could not read until he was 8 years old. And a teacher said to him, if his head were open, they would probably find a lump of fat where there was supposed to be a brain. That teacher was wrong. Einstein's parents were informed by a teacher that their son would never amount to anything. Again, rejection is not synonymous with failure. It does not forecast our future. Chesterton, Einstein, and Jesus can all attest to that. And so, like Jesus, we need to learn to handle rejection in such a way that it does not stop us from being who we are and what we're called to do. When Campbell Morgan was a candidate for the Wesleyan ministry, he passed the doctrinal examination. Then it was time to face the trial sermon. He was in an enormous auditorium that could seat more than 1,000 people, and there sat 3 ministers and 75 others who came to listen. I can only imagine what that would be like. But you know, Morgan was not up to the task, because 2 weeks later, his name appeared among those who were refused entrance to the ministry that year. Morgan messaged his father, giving one word: rejection. Quickly came a reply from his father: rejected on earth, accepted in heaven. Morgan went on to become one of Christendom's great preachers. But you know, there are many who could have that carved on their tombstone. Rejected on earth, accepted in heaven. Because we're accepted, loved, held by God, we can and we will be all that we're meant to be. It's been discovered that there are 2 fears that feed a person's sensitivity to rejection. One being the fear of being abandoned, and the other being the fear of losing one's identity. When young, one woman remembers that her dad had issues. He was always unhappy, and because that's how he seemed every time she was home, she thought she must be the problem. Maybe she complicated his life. Maybe she cost him money that he didn't have. Maybe it's because he wanted a girl and she was a girl and he never wanted a girl. She was desperate to be a treasured daughter. He used the word divorce often, and every threat of divorce was death breathing down her neck. Because if he left, then who would she be? A girl without a father, felt like a girl without having a place in the world. And if he couldn't love me, then who could? Who would? Love was something that did not grace her father's vocabulary, and a few years later he stopped coming home, and she remembers watching him pack his things, and he did it without even looking at her, and she said then she pressed her face against the window and watched his car fade in a blur, and he was gone. Rejection settled deep into her heart, and she came to one conclusion: I don't matter. I'm worth nothing to my dad. And then she started to think, I'm not worth anything to God either. This had become her new identity, the unwanted one. She needed a new way of defining her identity. And so to help her, she memorized these words from the Bible. I am one of God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved. Like her, our identity, it must be anchored in the truth. It must be anchored in the truth of who God is, who He is to us, and who we are to Him. Assuming We've all faced rejection, assuming we've all feared being abandoned and losing our identity at times. I invite you to say these words of prayer with me. I am yours, God, not who someone else says I am, not who social media likes or comments on, not who the grades, to-do lists, messes, and mess-ups say I am, not who the scale says I am, or the sum total of what my flaws say I am. I'm going to stop flirting with the unstable things of this world so I can fall completely in love with you. I am loved, I am held, I am yours forever. Amen.